3. On the Road, Impressions of U.S. History. One does not sell the earth upon which the people walk. Tashunka Witko, Crazy Horse. The man over there says women need to be helped in carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over puddles, or gives me the best place, and ain't I a woman? Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me, and ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children, and seen most of them sold into slavery. And when I cried out with mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Sojourner Truth. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had as now think vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. John Brown. A people's history is a powerful weapon. In the hands of the oppressors, history is twisted and caricatured. In the arsenal of the revolution, it helps us draw the difficult lessons from past struggles and identify the resistance which has always opposed the enemy. But history is a weapon only if used honestly. Only if reverses, as well as high points, accommodation with empire, and white supremacy as well as resistance to it are looked at straight on. Looking at the Founding Fathers as our radical predecessors or viewing our history as all struggle and no compromise does nothing to help us understand our present situation. The real history of the U.S. is almost totally unknown to the U.S. people. The most important parts have been buried, falsified, hidden from our view. U.S. history is a product of the conflict between European invaders and Native Americans, white masters and black slaves, the colonizing army and the colonized, bosses and workers, male supremacists and women, imperialists and anti-imperialists. What must be unearthed are the possibilities for liberation at any given time, how far these were carried, what held us back, what basis was laid for future struggles, including our own. This history is not meant to be definitive. It is not a complete or chronological analysis of the U.S. past. We focus on and analyze the periods which mark intersections or qualitative turning points in the people's struggle. Many critical periods are not examined, others are looked at only in passing. This analysis represents the beginning of a process, not its final conclusion. With the U.S. government now organizing for a patriotic outburst in 1976, this is an important time to begin learning real lessons from U.S. history, preparing to take them to the people. The bicentennial period can be transformed into a time of action and organizing, demolishing the myths, drawing on the examples and battles which have come before us. In the beginning, genocide, slavery, racism. The true history of the Americas begins with the original peoples of the hemisphere, the rise of the brilliant societies of the Mayas and the Toltecs, the Caribs in the Indies, the Incas of Peru, the Aztecs of Mexico, the Taínos of Borinquen, now Puerto Rico, the Iroquois of the Northeast, and the Pueblos in the southwest of the U.S. This history continues today from Latin America to Alaska. The first significant European intervention was by Christopher Columbus, an Italian in the pay of Genoan capital, who sailed under the flag of Spain. Columbus noted his first day on American soil that the people are ingenious and would make great servants. When Columbus returned to Hispaniola, Haiti, Santo Domingo, the occupying army he left to oversee the mining of Hispaniolan gold had been wiped out by the Carib people. Columbus attacked again, this time subduing the resistance and beginning systematic genocide against the Indians. In 1492, there were somewhat under 300,000 American Indians living in Hispaniola. By 1512, there were less than 14,000 Indians left on the Columbia's plantations. Whole areas lost their native populations in this way as the Spanish colonists worked millions of Indians to death. Since mines and plantations are run for profit and couldn't work without slaves, the Spanish did two things. They turned to the trade in African slaves to repopulate the Caribbean, and they also rationalized their plantation system. This was to ensure that the new slaves would live long enough to breed. In Mexico and South America, the Spanish adopted a system of peonage, a form of serfdom. A class of mestizos, persons of Spanish and Indian descent, developed. This system was carried to what is now Southwest and California. The British colonies were populated mainly by settlers. A whole group of dissenters, poor farmers, and workers fled poverty and oppression to come to the New World. Many were indentured servants or chronically unemployed. Others were poor people sentenced to long prison terms or deportation for small crimes. There were also some rich gentleman farmers and mercenaries out for loot. There was plenty of land in North America to be had by stealing it from the American Indians. In the South, land was suitable for tobacco, indigo, rice, sugarcane, and eventually cotton. These crops required a plantation economy and a large labor force. But with so much land for the taking, who would labor cheaply enough to make the plantation owners rich? Only forced labor, slaves. Chattel slaves, that is, not people but commodities. having no family worth respecting, no personal rights or property, bound for life and generations to come. Historically, the cultural and social justification of slavery had been religious. This was true during the Crusades in Europe and in the Mideast, and was carried by feudal Spain into its conquests in the Caribbean and South and Central America. Religion was the main ideological control of feudal society in early capitalism. Chattel slavery was defended as the means of saving the souls of ignorant heathens from eternal hellfire by giving them the blessing of Christianity. When Columbus exterminated the Indians of the Caribbean and replaced them with black slaves from Africa, several important changes occurred. The plantations grew cash crops for the market and became highly profitable. Slavery became the most powerful lever of expanding capitalism. The slave trade in human bodies itself was most profitable, together with cheaper food and raw materials. This assured the victory of a booming mercantile capitalism over the weaker economy of feudalism. Slavery was never a separate economy in the Caribbean or the southern colonies of North America. It served the capitalist market and capitalist production from the very first start. Huge profits from the slave trade went to the commercial ports of the budding industrial areas of the Northeast and New York. In short, the cornerstone of free enterprise is the enslavement of black Africans. In the British colonies of North America, unlike the Spanish colonies, there was a population of poor workers and farmers, competing religious groups, plus traditions of descent and ideas about free-born Englishmen. No matter how idealized these notions might have been, the fact of class struggle by a mainly Anglo-Dutch and German white population made the problems of control different than those in the Caribbean, where there was no Spanish workers other than soldiers. The Spanish Catholic Church, as a unified institution of the Spanish authoritarian state, was itself a powerful means of control within its missions, which were actually plantations as well. In the southern part of the British colonies of North America, conversions of blacks to Christianity tended to break down the traditional barriers between poor, indentured whites and black slaves. During the 17th century, blacks and whites escaped together from forced labor, intermarried, rebelled together in the West Indies, Virginia, South Carolina, and Maryland. Virginia planters began a Fugitive Act in 1643, which ordered that runaway slaves should serve additional time, twice the length of their absence, and should be branded with an R for rogue, for a second offense. Struggles continued to develop around length of service and working conditions. The faintest possibility of unity among the different classes of the oppressed terrified the slave owners. Because of this, distinctions of color and origin were promoted into an entire system of racism. Africans were made slaves for life, while the white servants were to be freed after a set period. The planters began the conscious cultivation of whites as overseers, using the myth of the free-born Englishman, in contrast to the African, now deemed an animal, less than human. Discrimination based on color already did exist in Europe, North Africa, and the Mideast. However, these ideas were still incidental and subordinate to concepts of native or foreigner, Christian or pagan, aristocrat or peasant. Racism as a prime social and cultural dividing line was born in North America out of slavery. It was born out of greed for profit, perpetrated by deception and a monopoly of firearms, not of biological superiority, real or imagined. The notion that slavery is somehow based upon racial and cultural inferiority of Africans and other third world peoples has been deeply embedded into every U.S. institution as the chief means of brainwashing and using the white population. The importance of this to us is to begin to focus on the other, hidden side of our history that the rulers conceal. Racism is not only directed at black people, it is also aimed at controlling whites to keep black people in slavery, and the rulers firmly in command. The institutionalizing of white supremacy created a structure to divide the white worker and the small farmer from the black slave. Coupled with the economic bribe of white privilege, it is the cornerstone of U.S. history, the rock upon which capitalism and imperialism has been erected. It is not the material bribe alone that is effective. It is the bribe plus self-justification, social approval, and status, backed up by punishment for nonconformity, that does the trick. The U.S. invented a new kind of racism and a more horrible form of slavery. It has been building on this ever since, and exporting its variety of racism to the rest of the world. The African slave trade was an unprecedented event in human history. The modern slave trade went on for 350 years. It came to an end about 100 years ago. Africans were kidnapped on the west coast of Africa and brought to the West Indies in exchange for tobacco, cotton, rice, and molasses. In turn, slaves and the sugar products were carried to the mainland colonies, which sent food to the West Indies, tobacco and rice to Europe, and distilled rum from molasses to Africa. The first African slave arrived here in 1619. By 1770, 4/5 of all colonial exports were rum to Africa. 10 to 15 million Africans were landed in the Americas. More than that, estimates range from between 20 and 200 million died on the way. This was the triangular slave trade, the very foundation of rising capital. Native American resistance, the early stages. Will we let ourselves be destroyed in our turn without a struggle? Give up our homes, our country bequeathed to us by the Great Spirit, the graves of our deed, and everything that is dear and sacred to us? I know you will cry with me. Never, never. Tecumseh. In North America, Native Americans prevented their enslavement as a people by fighting for their land and freedom. Indians waged protracted wars of resistance, holding out in parts of the U.S. until 1890. In spite of destruction of whole nations, Indian culture and Indian people survive and fight to this day. Perhaps 2 million Native Americans within what is now the U.S. were killed in battle, died as slaves due to extreme overwork and little food, or from white man's disease like measles and smallpox. They could not be captured in sufficient numbers to supply the labor force needed to enrich the European slave owners and merchants. When the attempt to enslave Indians failed, the colonizers went on to destroy Indian power and seize their land. King Philip, leader of the Wampanoags, the rescuers of the starving pilgrims, an event ritualized at Thanksgiving, understood what was happening. He worked to bring together neighboring nations and drive the settlers out. His armies fought hard, attacking 52 of the 90 New England colonial towns. Internal disputes, a hard winter, betrayals, and superior firepower defeated the rebellion, which ended in August 1676. Many Indians, along with King Philip, were killed. During the colonial period, except at the very first when the settlers were weak and couldn't make it on their own, a few whites accepted Indians as human beings. Some backward people, a number of runaway servants, religious outcasts, and dissenters were friendly. Considerable numbers of escaped slaves also developed ties with Indian people, notably the Seminoles in Florida. But the prevailing attitudes were expressed by the Dutch patroons introducing tomahawks in New Amsterdam, later to become New York City, to frontiersmen eager to scalp Indians for $100 bounty, a huge sum for those days. This was the origin of the saying, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." The colonists came from poor, depressed parts of Europe, eager for land. The desire for land, and with it freedom from servitude and wage labor, dominated early colonial and U.S. history. Land ownership was a viable resolution of many social and class contradictions. In 1763, the British forbade colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains. This curbed the land speculations of the wealthiest colonists like George Washington, Ben Franklin, and Pat Henry. It was one of the causes of the Revolution of 1776. After the Revolution, the speculators felt free to move into the West. Many Indian tribes understood the government's intentions. While the American Revolution was fought against the fetters imposed by British colonialism on the rapidly developing colonial economy, it was certainly not fought in the interests of either Native Americans or black slaves. Consider the following condemnation of King George in the Declaration of Independence. He has excited domestic insurrection against us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of the frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Declaration of Independence. Washington's troops burned Iroquois villages during the Revolutionary War. Not one major tribe lined up with the colonists during the Revolution. In 1787, Congress authorized the takeover of the Ohio Valley. The Shawnee and the Miami, united by 30 years of struggle, fought back. Led by Little Turtle, they defeated a 1,400-man U.S. force in 1790, and in 1791 routed St. Clair's army of 2,000. In 1794, Mad Anthony Wayne invaded Indian Territory, defeated the Shawnee at Fallen Timbers, and celebrated the victory by burning every Indian village on the way back to his fort. The victors forced the Treaty of Greenville upon the Indians and poured in missionaries, whiskey, and settlers. But the Indians still did not capitulate. From the Shawnee arose a great American Indian leader, Tecumseh, or Tecumseh, Panther lying in wait. He rallied the nations, traveling from Canada, Iroquois land, to Missouri, Osage Territory, to Florida, Seminole Nation. He argued for unified resistance, denounced alcohol, and with the help of his brother, called for a revival of Indian culture and ways. He saw the moment as a strategic one, a last chance such as will never occur again for us Indians of North America to form ourselves into one great combination. Tecumseh allied with the British in the War of 1812, starting off by capturing Detroit. The British betrayed Tecumseh, who died fighting a year later. President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. This territory, almost equal in size to the entire U.S. at that date, was actually the land of the Sauk, Fox, and other Indian tribes. Andrew Jackson, known as Sharp Knife to the Cherokees, rose to the presidency by winning fame as an Indian killer and village burner. He used charges of Indian violence to move into Florida, Texas, and Canada. Jackson was a popular hero. Nearly everyone wanted more land, and the only disputes were over how best to grab it from the Indians. Spearheading the land grab, the U.S. Army established forts throughout the Indian Territory and began offensive operations. General Winfield Scott, a leading figure in U.S. wars against Mexico, was responsible for the Trail of Tears of the Cherokees in 1838. An entire people were forcibly removed from their homeland in the southeastern U.S. and marched all the way to a reservation in Oklahoma. The wars against the Indians, like the war against Mexico in 1848, was a war of conquest, a war for land. Demands now being made by Native Americans for land for their own sovereignty as separate nations challenges all the terms upon which the U.S. built its empire, and this is why the Native American movement has a special significance for people fighting U.S. imperialism. Black resistance to slavery and the rise of the abolitionist and women's movements. The growing conflict between the northern and southern systems of production laid a basis for the Civil War. The southern system was based on slavery and the cultivation of cotton as a main crop. In 1793, the invention of the cotton gin gave the cotton industry, and with it slavery, a new economic boost. It made cleaning the southern short staple cotton fairly efficient. More abundant and cheaper cotton also helped expand the textile industry in the Northeast, which became the center for manufacturing. Cotton cultivation exhausted the soil, which created the continuing need for expansion of the plantation system into new territory. Up to 1860, the southern slave owners attempted to expand the slave system. Seaboard Atlantic states turned to slave breeding, while the expansionists eyed Cuba and Central America. Northern collaboration and compromise aided the planters. The seizure of Texas in 1836 from Mexico and its admission to the Union was part of a slave owner's plot to introduce 6 new slave states into the Union. But many northern industrialists and financiers recognized the further spread of slavery would stifle their own ambitions. More profits and more political stability could be had by opening up the West and Southwest to industrial exploitation and free farming. The planters won a great legal victory in 1857 with the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which sanctioned the introduction of slavery into any free territory, even against the will of the majority of the settlers. It was the continued resistance of black slaves and their allies which finally brought matters to a head. As early as 1793, Toussaint Louverture led a famous slave revolution in Haiti against the French. The Haitian Revolution terrified the southern slave owners, who feared that the example would spark similar uprisings in North America. Toussaint's forces used drums to communicate with each other. Drums were now banned from the southern plantations. Each rebellion spread panic throughout the slave-holding South. Gabriel Prosser's in Virginia in 1800. Denmark Vesey's in South Carolina in 1822. The Amistad Mutiny, led by Joseph Cinque, from whom Rachel Cinque McGee and SLA Field Marshal Cinque take their names today, in 1831, and Nat Turner's uprisings in Virginia in 1831. In 1829, David Walker, a freed black man, published David Walker's Appeal, which called upon the slaves to rise up in revolution against their bondage. Escape was a major form of slave resistance. Black soldiers returning from the War of 1812 brought back the news that slavery was outlawed in Canada. Routes of flight, twisting network of paths, developed across the Appalachians, up through the Ohio, and along the eastern seacoast. These were the routes of the Underground Railroad, which in the 1840s prided itself on being the only railroad guaranteed not to break down. In the 1850s, something like 500 black people a year penetrated the South under the most dangerous conditions to lead others to freedom. Harriet Tubman, called Moses by the slaves, was the most famous conductor. Not intimidated by a huge bounty on her head, she led hundreds north without ever losing a passenger. She said, "There are 2 things I've got a right to, and these are death and liberty. One or the other I mean to have. No one will take me back alive." At the bottom of page 52 is an old bill of sale, Public Sale of Negroes, by Richard Clagett. On Tuesday, March 5th, 1833, at 1 p.m., the following slaves will be sold at Potter's Mart in Charleston, South Carolina. Miscellaneous lots of Negroes, mostly house servants, some for field work. Conditions: cash, balanced by bond, bearing interest from date of sale. Payable in 1 to 2 years, to be secured by a mortgage of the Negroes, and appraised personal security. Auctioneer will pay for the papers. A valuable Negro woman, accustomed to all kinds of housework. Is a good plain cook, an excellent dairymaid, washes and irons. She has 4 children. 1 a girl about 13 years of age, another 7, a boy about 5, and an infant 11 months old. 2 of the children will be sold with the mother, the others separately, if it best suits the purchaser. A valuable blacksmith, wife, and daughters. The smith is in the prime of his life, and a perfect master at his trade. His wife, about 27 years old, and his daughters, 12 and 10 years old, have been brought up as house servants, and as such are very valuable. Also for sale, two likely young Negro wenches, one of whom is 16 and the other 13, both of whom have been taught and accustomed to the duties of house servants. The 16-year-old wench has one eye. A likely yellow girl, about 17 or 18 years old, has been accustomed to all kinds of house and garden work. She is sold for no fault, sound as $1. House servants, the owner of the family described herein, would sell them for a good price only. They are offered for no fault whatever. But because they can be done without, and money is needed, he has been offered $12.50. They consist of a man 30 to 33 years old, who has been raised in a genteel Virginia family as a house servant, carriage driver, etc., in all in which he excels. His wife, a likely wench of 25 to 30, raised in a like manner, as a chambermaid, seamstress, nurse, etc. Their twin children, girls of 12 and 5 or 4, they are bright mulattoes, of mild tractable dispositions, unassuming manners, and of genteel appearance, and well worthy the notice of a gentleman of fortune needing such. Also, 14 Negro wenches, ranging from ages 16 to 25, all sound and capable of doing a good day's work in the house or field. Page 53. The success of the Underground Railroad resulted in the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which ordered Northerners to return escaped slaves to the South and legalized the practice of vigilantes and slave hunters. Quakers, New Englanders, Pennsylvanians, Ohioans cooperated with black people to rescue some 75,000 slaves in this brave episode in our history. Black resistance defined the militant terms of the anti-slavery fight, and was an example of the two mass movements which grew up alongside the black struggle, the women's movement and abolitionists. During the early 1800s, large numbers of women entered the textile mills and factories of New England for the first time. Often they found themselves at odds with the 19th century standards of factory decorum, and with that fact they were paid far less than men doing the same work. The first strike by women took place in Dover, New Hampshire mills in 1828. Proletarianization of U.S. women in the Northeast, the social contract in the mills, was a background for the upsurge in consciousness and protest among women which would develop over the next few decades. Bourgeois women, recently freed from household chores like weaving, sewing, soap mixing, also began to chafe at the limitations imposed of them because of sex. From the earliest days of the anti-slavery fight, courageous women like Fanny Wright and Maria W. Stewart defied scorn and ridicule in order to speak out in public. Soon, female anti-slavery societies were formed throughout the North, trying to recruit activists for the Underground Railway to write, persuade, and awaken their sisters to the tyranny of slavery. Women raised both the issue of abolition and equality for women. Slaveholders and male supremacists responded with threats of mob violence and bitter attacks on the women's characters and reputations. Angelina and Sarah Grimke, born to a Southern slaveholding family, spoke out on both freedoms and opposed more conservative elements in the anti-slavery movement who were afraid of losing support if the subject of women's freedom was raised. In 1840, the Anti-Slavery Convention in London refused to seat women. Experienced and tireless U.S. women abolitionists were forced to sit behind curtains while the main debate went on. Charles Revson, a black abolitionist, and William Lord Garrison joined the women as a protest. 8 years later, the Women's Convention at Seneca Falls called for unconditional equality for women. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards women, having in direct object the establishment of absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Seneca Falls. For over a quarter of a century, until a serious split developed after the Civil War, the two movements, to free the slaves and to liberate women, nourished and strengthened each other. White women openly advocated for freedom for black people. Black and white women walked calmly together through the mobs of angry men, openly challenging the paranoia of plantation morality with its emphasis on the protection of dependent white women. This was a bold blow to racist and sexist ideology. If you flip back to page 54, there's a song. John Brown's body lying a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he lost his life in struggling for the slaves, his soul is marching on. John Brown died that the slaves might be free. John Brown died that the slaves might be free. John Brown died that the slaves might be free. But his soul is marching on. He captured Harper's Ferry with his 19 men so true. He frightened old Virginia till she trembled through and through. They hung him for a traitor, themselves the traitor crew, but his soul is marching on. America's working folks are all remembering the spot. America's working folks are all remembering the spot. America's working folks are all remembering the spot. It's the grave of old John Brown. Now has come the glorious Jubilee. Now has come the glorious Jubilee. Now has come the glorious Jubilee, when all mankind shall be free. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His soul goes marching on. Back to page 55. Contrary to the lies of the official bourgeois history, the abolitionists were not abstract moralists, but a social movement based on the urgent necessity to end slavery. There were fierce struggles within the movement over goals and tactics. The abolitionists were split over the question of revolutionary violence, with a substantial number of white abolitionists unwilling to accept the terms of the anti-slavery struggle. The leadership of free black people and escaped slaves like Henry Garnett, David Walker, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Sojourner Truth consistently pushed the abolitionists to more militant stance. National conventions of black people in the North advocated the armed overthrow of the slave system, while some abolitionists put forward notions of slaves going quietly back to Africa. Douglass's paper, The North Star, was a voice for immediate emancipation and full rights for blacks. Douglass argued for more militant resistance to slavery. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waves. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both a moral and physical. But it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. At their best, the abolitionists refused to ignore, and more refused to let anyone else ignore, the reality of slavery. We see in the abolitionists the beginnings of a tradition of mass white support for black liberation. The tensions and disagreements within the movement were not unlike those our own movement has faced, especially concerning black people's right to direct their own struggle. Abolitionists were called fanatics, lunatics, and promoters of rebellion. Garrison's defense of the Nat Turner Rebellion, in which 60 white people were killed, brought the wrath of slavery forces upon him. But he escalated, carrying out a speaking tour of New England. From the large crowds which turned out to hear him came the first meeting for the New England Anti-Slavery Society, held on January 1st, 1832. They called for immediate emancipation of slaves without any compensation to the slave owners. Simultaneously, a campaign for education and literacy went on clandestinely in the South, more openly in the North. The precious and outlawed right of black people to read became a battleground, as it is yet today. Prudence Crandall opened her school in Connecticut to 20 or 30 black girls in 1831. This led to her imprisonment, the burning down of her house, and attempts to suppress the school. Abolitionists like the Grimke sisters, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Wendell Phillips engaged in struggles for prison reforms against capital punishment, in support of Indian rights and equal rights for women. Theodore Parker hid black fugitives in his Boston church and protected them with guns. And then there was old Osamawati, John Brown. Brown led the 4 years of guerrilla warfare in Kansas, which kept that state from falling to the slavers. It was this victory in Kansas which drove the South to secede before the anti-slavery forces grew too much stronger. W.E.B. Du Bois marked this as the start of the Civil War. In 1859, John Brown with a band of Kansas free soilers and ex-slaves attacked the Harper's Ferry arsenal in western Virginia, in direct response to the Dred Scott decision. Harriet Tubman planned to participate, but was too ill to go along. John Brown's courage and sacrifice has been maligned as insanity, but he had a practical plan which almost worked. Even in defeat, he accomplished his stated goal of polarizing the mass of Northerners against slavery. Brown's action helped destroy the slavery economy of Virginia, as many plantation owners, terrified by the accelerating number of slave uprisings following Brown's raid, sold their slaves in panic. The Harper's Ferry action was an effective use of armed struggle to sharpen an already ripe political situation. John Brown is an example to us of dedication, belief in people's power to affect history, and the willingness to risk everything in the cause of liberation.
And betrayal. The Civil War began as a war fought by white people over the future of the Union. At first, the U.S. government ignored black people. There was no attempt to recruit them into the Union Army. They were not allowed to enlist. Union soldiers were forbidden to sing John Brown's Body, Slavery, the underlying cause of the war, was a suppressed issue. Over time, pushed by its wartime need for laborers and soldiers, and by the eagerness of black people to fight against the slave owners, the North moved towards emancipation. Fugitive slaves, including Harriet Tubman, joined the Northern forces. General Tubman led her troops in dangerous scouting and guerrilla operations during the war. With emancipation in 1863, thousands of blacks joined the army. Before the war's end, 200,000 black people fought for the Union, often in the front lines as shock troops. 300,000 more helped as laborers, scouts, and spies for the North. Many other black women and men left the plantations in a general strike against the planters. This crippled the slave economy and the Southern war effort. The Emancipation Proclamation legally freed 4 million black people from chattel slavery. Abraham Lincoln acted in order to win the war, and because the slaves were already freeing themselves. This was an important victory for black people and the abolitionist movement they had inspired. A sense of optimism and determination to consolidate and extend their gains swept through the black population in the South. In the post-war Reconstruction period, unique in U.S. history, blacks and their white allies began a remarkable effort to transform the Southern system. Black historians, notably W.E.B. Du Bois, have challenged the lies of standard history of Reconstruction, which all of us were taught in school. In his book, Black Reconstruction, Du Bois catalogs the tremendous achievements of the Reconstruction era, poor and black people participating in government for the first time, voting and holding office, the introduction of progressive income tax, the first massive public school program in the South, tentative attempts at land redistribution, the temporary disenfranchisement of many planters and slaveholders, the abolition of imprisonment for debt, the expansion of women's rights in marriage. Black people raised the demand for 40 acres and a mule for every ex-slave, since without land reform, emancipation would leave them at the mercy of the planter class. This demand was never met because its content challenged not only the planters, but also the Northern interests who were in the process of taking over Southern agriculture. Gains made in public education are testimony to the progressive character of Reconstruction. At the end of the Civil War, there were no more public schools in the South. By 1870, there were 250,000 children in 4,300 schools. This was the result of an astonishing effort by hundreds of Northern volunteers and abolitionists, with the substantial support of Southern black communities and families. 45% of the teachers were women, black women from the South, and white women from the North. The schools they built survived the overthrow of Reconstruction, but were largely rigidly segregated by race. This was a time of slow, painstaking efforts by blacks to build working relationships with the dispossessed whites of the South, alliances which never fully developed. They were finally shattered when Northern capital and the remnants of the old planter class reassumed control. The support of poor whites, working people, and other progressive whites for Reconstruction also involved tens of thousands of Northern white women and men who came south as volunteers, the carpetbaggers, slandered and defamed by later generations. Reconstruction was one of the high points of unity between black and white, overcoming white supremacy and racism in our history. This is why it has been written out of the history texts. The pro-Reconstruction forces had great strength for a while. They failed by only one vote to convict President Andrew Johnson after impeaching him for supporting the ex-slave owners and sabotaging Reconstruction. Johnson won because the capitalist North, victorious over its former and future partners, the Southern planters, were eager to get on with the conquest of the West. Crushing Reconstruction involved the conscious reinstatement of white supremacy in order to destroy a kind of people's unity, if not defeated in the South, could have spread to class war in the North. The counter-revolution disguises the Compromise of 1877. The word compromise should read betrayal. Northern Republicans sold out the black population by allowing federal troops to be withdrawn from the South, leaving ex-slaves and white Reconstructionists open to the terror campaigns of the planter class. Some of these troops were then sent north to help break strikes. Others were used in the final military campaigns against the Ogalas, Hunkpapas, Cheyennes, and Nez Perce. A new power alliance emerged in the U.S. Old and new Southern planters were restored to local power by accepting Northern capital's domination in both Southern agriculture and industry. This rule was enforced by the terror of the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was established by a planter class to prevent black people and their white allies from consolidating their political gains. Through the Klan, like the old slave patrols, poor whites helped terrorize and control blacks. Black people were forced back into subjugation through mob violence and lynching, Jim Crow laws, and wholesale disenfranchisement, and white skin became the cultural definition of power once again. While there were scattered attempts at black-white unity in these days, they fell apart as many poor whites destroyed the basis for genuine alliance by defending white supremacy. With the planters restored to the land, black people were thrust back into a new form of slavery, sharecropping. Sharecroppers rented plots of land from the planters and in return kept a small share of what they produced. Sharecroppers provided the planters with the bulk of the cotton crop and had to rent tools and other necessities from them. Black sharecroppers were in debt, bound to the planters, and enslaved. The consolidation of class rule and the crushing of the popular movement wrecked the hopes of a new South. The South remains an underdeveloped region of the U.S. to this day. Defeating Reconstruction was a prerequisite to the completion of continental expansion and the strengthening of capitalist power. It was accomplished by terror, the lynch rope, and treachery. Supposed white allies deserted black freedom and women. The hopeful possibilities of the era were shattered by all the forces of the racist order, and a decisive step was taken on the road to full-blown modern U.S. imperialism. Expansion and conquest. The birth of modern U.S. imperialism. Throughout this time, the U.S. was consolidating its hold over Mexican and Indian land. Once New Mexico and California were seized, the looting of land and minerals proceeded rapidly. Through the destruction of Mexican land titles, mestizo farmers were reduced to laborers on their own land. Mexicans, along with imported Chinese and Filipino laborers, became the chief cheap labor supply for the farms, cattle ranches, mines, and railroads of the strategic part of the West. California provided important deep water ports on the Pacific Ocean and industrial sites in gold. Northern industrialists had moved ahead with the Transcontinental and Santa Fe railroads. The former was built by Chinese and Irish labor, the latter by Mexicans. As railroads moved west, the last of the Indian lands were conquered. By the late 1870s, the heart of Indian resistance was shattered. Crazy Horse was assassinated by government agents in 1877 at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. In 1890, the U.S. committed the Wounded Knee Massacre. Rumors of Indian resurgence had been sweeping the country. The Ghost Dance, a Paiute prophecy of a return to native power, had taken root at Pine Ridge Reservation. When the U.S. Army attacked on December 29, 1890, it was not a spontaneous crime. It was an attempt to wipe out hostile Indians to commit genocide against the Oglala Nation. Over 300 Indians were killed, many women and children. Afterwards, 18 cavalrymen received congressional medals of honor for gallantry and bravery. This was the age of the robber barons, the time when Rockefeller, Morgan, and Carnegie made their first stolen fortunes. The normal cycles of capitalist production gutted the markets and caused a series of depressions. In the 27 years between the Panic of 1873 and 1900, over half were years of depression. As the big industrialists and financiers made their money, the people went hungry and were forced out of work. Capitalism squeezed its domestic workforce to the bone, and the workers in the northern and western industrial centers of the working class raised the specter of class warfare at a time when the frontier, the traditional safety valve for class discontent, was shrinking. Workers were crowding the cities, forming new communities, understanding the need for collective action. The era of monopoly capitalism was dawning. The ruling class looked to colonial expansion as a solution to economic crisis and rising class discontent. Revolt within the Spanish Empire opened opportunities in the Caribbean and the Philippine Islands. Rival imperialist powers were engaged in full-scale contention over the penetration of China, so the idea of a strategic base in the Philippines was tempting. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was a case of imperialist aggression cloaked in democratic slogans. The McKinley administration at first justified the war as an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist support to the rebelling Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Filipino peoples. The battleship Maine was sent to Havana and sunk as a final incitement. Puerto Rico was seized as a U.S. colony. Cuba was not seized outright. It was instead made a protectorate with control imposed by the U.S. through the hated Platt Amendment. The U.S. occupied Guantanamo and set up a naval base there. This base remains a constant U.S. colonial presence in liberated Cuba. In the Philippines, Theodore Roosevelt and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Senator Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, hatched plots with Admiral Dewey to seize Manila and prepare armed intervention to recolonize the island. By the time Dewey got there, the Filipino Liberation Forces had taken all the rest of the country from the Spanish. A phony attack on U.S. lines outside of Manila was staged, a model for the attack Johnson staged on the U.S. Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1965, and the counter-revolutionary war was on. It lasted 6 years, required a U.S. force of 90,000 soldiers at its peak, and ended with 600,000 Filipinos dead on Luzon Island alone. Those who lived found themselves under harsher rule than even that of the Spanish. Filipinos to this day are fighting guerrilla warfare against U.S.-supplied troops and a U.S.-backed neo-colonial regime. As the war went on, and the U.S. soldiers died from wounds and diseases, the truth about Filipino resistance came out, and direct racist and economic appeals to workers and businessmen replaced cover-ups about fighting for Filipino freedom. William Randolph Hearst made his fortune by whipping up racist war fever in his columns. The Hearst papers ran banner headlines arguing that the Yellow Peril must be defeated. There was opposition. Individuals like Mark Twain, an anti-imperialist league in Massachusetts, which grew to have branches in Chicago and the far west. Some workers' organizations, especially among the Boston Irish, plus a few abolitionist and populist veterans. But it is important to understand why. In spite of strong anti-colonial traditions going back to Revolutionary War days, most people finally accepted this leap into full-fledged and open imperialism. Class struggle at home was muted by plunder abroad. Many workers supported imperialist expansion as an acceptable way to ease economic crisis in the U.S. With the war against the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, many U.S. citizens condoned imperialism in the same way they had grown accustomed to justifying genocide against Native Americans or lynching of black sharecroppers. The ruling class organized for world empire in the same way it organized for continental conquest. Racism against Mexican farmhands and Chinese laborers was now turned against Cubans, Filipinos, and Puerto Ricans. Internationalism, the commitment to unity and struggle with other people in other lands against the common enemy, does not spring up automatically from a culture poisoned by slavery, internal colonization, and the slaughter of the native population. It has to be fought for consistently. Moreover, when leaders of the American Federation of Labor, like Samuel Gompers, ended up supporting the war against the Philippines, they began more and more to sabotage the struggles of millions of unorganized immigrant laborers, women, and unskilled workers. They looked down on these workers as outcasts, and often showed the same contempt for them as the despised Filipino and black communities. The AFL came to represent mainly the aristocracy of labor. Daniel De Leon, a socialist organizer, called the AFL the labor lieutenants of the capitalist class. Based in the highly skilled crafts, elitist, all-white, opposed to militancy, the AFL even then served as an emergency brake on the class struggle. The opposition: miners, women, immigrants, wobblies. Alongside this history of accommodation to imperialism, there are also the great movements and acts of opposition: the stirrings, the militant strikes, the courage of the Haymarket martyrs, the women's shirt-waist makers, the Wobblies, the Molly Maguires, the Western Federation of Miners, the day-to-day survival struggles of the immigrants. In this disloyal opposition, we can recognize our roots. On May 4th, 1886, in Chicago, a workers' rally was called to protest the murder of striking McCormick Harvester employees a few days before. As it ended, a bomb was tossed, killing one policeman. 7 labor and anarchist leaders were framed and convicted, and 4 were executed for the act. From this struggle, people all around the world commemorate May Day. The city of Chicago erected a monument to police power, the statue of a policeman which, until recently, stood in Haymarket Square. In the 1890s, miners in Colorado and Idaho faced the guns of federal and state troops as they fought for the 8-hour workday. After long hours in the mines, workers would meet, teach each other to read, argue politics, talk about socialism and revolution. In 1892, the Western Federation of Miners formed, an organization which led major strikes throughout the next decade. In the same year, the Homestead Strike was crushed when federal troops massacred striking steelworkers in Pennsylvania. In the early 1900s, the labor force underwent a rapid transformation as 15 million immigrants came to the U.S. Those who came from Europe settled in the industrial and commercial centers in the East and Midwest. Subject to discrimination, viewed as un-American by much of the population, they initiated and led some of the fiercest U.S. labor struggles. A movement arose in this period called the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies. The preamble to the IWW Constitution, written in 1905, reads, "The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. There can be no peace so long as hunger and want are found among millions of working people, and the few, who make up the employing class, have all the good things of life. Between these two classes, a struggle must go on until the workers of the world organize as a class, take possession of the earth and the machinery of production, and abolish the waste system." Bottom of page 61. The Pebble Girl. Page 62, right-hand side graphic, a number of marching and militant laborers and strikers. Page 63, some famous photos of the same, as well as a picture of 2 black men being lynched. Page 64. The Wobblies came from the miners' strikes in Colorado, from the immigrant textile workers of the eastern commercial centers, from women workers, from the lumber workers of the far west. The IWW challenged the narrow and elitist craft union approach of the AFL and advocated industrial unionism, organizing all the workers of an industry into one union. The Wobblies organized the unorganized and the dispossessed. The Wobblies had serious weakness. They underestimated the need for strong organization. downplayed political agitation and action, and never developed an effective long-range strategy. Although the Wobblies were never the chief force in the labor movement, their influence was widespread. They participated in thousands of strikes and actions and helped lead effective mass strikes in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, Paterson, New Jersey in 1913, and Seattle, Washington in 1919. The Wobblies refused to sign labor contracts, always reserving the right to strike. They advocated revolution and socialism, opposed imperialist war, and made great breakthroughs in work with immigrants, women, and children. The Wobblies were among the first organizers to recognize the importance of explaining to the children and strikers the political issues involved in the strikes. Wobbly children's meetings helped in keeping families together through the long and difficult strikes. There were many immigrants among the masses of women who now entered the factories. Often, the bosses placed women of different nationalities next to one another on workbenches, hoping that language barriers and cultural differences would hinder the possibility for unity. Women worked as domestics in the textile industries of New England and New York, garment sweatshops, laundry, and food services. In 1909 and 1910, the women shirtwaist makers' strikes erupted in New York City. 60% of the workers were women. 70% were between the ages of 16 and 25. They worked 56 hours a week in dingy lofts. Women pushed the corrupt male union leadership to support their demands for shorter work hours and decent working conditions. Bottom of page 64 is a graphic of what appears to be a working class woman. Back to page 65. At one pre-strike meeting, Clara Lemlich, a young organizer, interrupted the speeches of union officials to decry the go-slow attitude and call for a strike. In the 2 months of the strike, over 1,000 strikers were arrested. The shirtwaist makers' militancy spurred the organizing of union shops throughout the entire garment industry. These early strikes confronted the women's suffrage movement with the importance of joining the life and death struggles of their working sisters. In 1914, the Rockefeller-owned state militia burned a striking miners' tent colony in Ludlow, Colorado, killing 2 women and 13 children. 30 miners were shot down in the ensuing battle. Attica was not the first massacre ordered by a Rockefeller. A suffrage leader named Elizabeth Freeman led pickets against Rockefeller Standard Oil offices in New York to protest the Ludlow massacre. Strikes often stretched out for long months, involved desperate hunger and want, loss of life, and many times despair at crumbling fighting strength. In these situations, family hardship is tremendous, and the strength and fighting capacity of women and children became critical. Organizing retaliation, strike support, food, medical help, and supplies, fighting on the picket lines, persuading scabs not to scab, and holding out, leading, persistent, have all been done by women. Women held special women's meetings in the Lawrence and Paterson strikes. They opened up the struggle against the lord and master attitude of many of the men, demanded that the full burdens of housework and raising children be shared. The official labor movements were worse than indifferent for the most part. When textile workers and the women in the food industry were first organized, it was at the initiative of the women themselves or of radical left-wing organizers like the Wobblies. There is a male monopoly on the decisive post of leadership in traditional unions of women workers. Yet there are names to remember of great women class fighters: Mother Jones, Ella Reeve Bloor, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Kate Richards O'Hare, Lucy Parsons, and Emma Goldman. Women organized and led other social and cultural movements parallel to the labor struggles and the suffrage movement. Anti-lynching crusades were waged by heroic black women with the sometimes support of suffragists and feminists. As summarized by Mary Church Terrell, lynching is the aftermath of slavery. Between 1865 and 1895, over 10,000 black men were killed without trial. Pretext for this reign of terror changed over time, settling finally on avenging assaults on white Southern women. These cruel rationales were challenged and repudiated by Ida B. Wells Barnett, a black journalist for who over 40 years investigated each case of lynching and proved that lynching was a systematic campaign of economic and political terror. She was the founder of the Negro Women's Club movement and challenged white women's organizations to take a stand against lynching. She later became a founder, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, of the NAACP. Women like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald exposed and fought the oppressive conditions in immigrant sectors of crowded cities. Women agitated for decent health care, birth control, education, and child labor laws. Graphic on page 66 is a map of Turtle Island, nations of the Iroquois Confederacy: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscandra. It also has other tribe names such as Cree, Blackfoot, Nez Perce, Crow, Paiute, Navajo, Apache, and so on. On page 67 Another graphic. It is a graphic of the United States, Turtle Island, colonized by foreign powers, including Alaska, purchased from Russia, 1867. Hawaii, annexed by the United States, 1898. Texas, annexed, 1845. First 13 states, acquired by conquest, the Midwest. From Britain, some parts of the north of the United States. Oregon Country, 1846. Louisiana Purchase from France, 1803. Page 68. Racism as a prime social and cultural dividing line was born in North America. Out of slavery, it was born of greed for profit, perpetrated by deception and a monopoly of firearms, not out of biological superiority, real or imagined. The notion that slavery is somehow based upon racial and cultural inferiority of Africans and other third world peoples has been deeply embedded into every U.S. institution as the chief means of brainwashing and using the white population. John Brown is an example to us of dedication, belief in people's power to affect history, and the willingness to risk everything in the cause of liberation. Reconstruction was one of the high points of overcoming white supremacy and racism in our history. This is why it has been written out of history texts. Internationalism, the commitment to unity and struggle with other peoples in other lands against the common enemy, does not spring automatically from a culture poisoned by slavery, internal colonization, and the slaughter of the native population. It has to be fought for constantly. Page 69. The long struggle for women's suffrage was won in 1920. Women organizers worked for almost 100 years to gain the vote, in the process transforming the consciousness of the whole country. They were opposed every step of the way. Incredible effort, militancy, and patient organizing were carried out decade after decade for the basic recognition of women's humanity and role in society. The cost paid for this victory, however, was great. The suffrage movement came to include open arguments for giving women the vote on anti-immigrant grounds and in order to maintain a white majority, since black women would face disenfranchisement in the South. Anti-foreign and anti-Indian rationales were used by suffragists who opposed the vote for enlightened church-going women against the specter of the coarse, vicious, and ignorant population of the slums. Sisters who knew better began saying that the black question and the question of women were not related. Proposals from black women urging fights against segregation were dismissed as outside issues. The pact between white supremacy in the South and suffrage for women was sealed in 1903 on the issue of states' rights, when a women's suffrage convention decided that locals could decide in all policy questions of membership. This ensured that many suffrage associations were segregated. By 1913, at the March on Washington for Suffrage, Ida Wells Barnett was not asked to march in the Illinois delegation, and at the final hour, 6,000 black women who applied for membership in the National Association of Women's Suffrage were told to wait because suffrage was imminent. While many other women activists were involved in the militant social movements of the day, linking the oppression of women to a class analysis of U.S. society, the suffrage movement became trapped in a more and more narrow fight for the vote. The victory, when it came, was rendered hollow by the compromises with white supremacy that had been made along the way. This is a familiar pattern in U.S. radical history. Most U.S. radicals traditionally downplayed the Black Revolution. Problems of race were seen as secondary to the real class struggle of white workers. One of the earliest unions, the National Labor Union, refused to organize black workers. Eugene V. Debs' American Railway Union barred black people from membership. The Socialist Party had segregated party cells in the South. Racism in the U.S. labor movement was seldom challenged by the left. A test for all opposition movements came with the onset of World War I. The First World War was a fight of rival imperialist powers for colonies, investments, raw materials, and world hegemony. Millions of people died while the different governments experimented with germ warfare and tested out new weapons systems. Although most of the socialist parties in the Second International supported their own governments in the war, there were major revolts against the war by workers, soldiers, and poor people. The Third International was formed by Lenin in 1919 in opposition to the national chauvinism of the organized parties at the time. In the U.S., many individual wobblies actively opposed the war, although the IWW did not take an anti-war stance. Eugene V. Debs and other left-wing socialists like William Z. Foster and other labor organizers, Jane Addams, Jeanette Rankin, and other women activists all opposed the war. The greatest event of the war years, as far as oppressed people were concerned, was the victory of the Russian Revolution in 1917. Establishment of the world's first socialist revolution sent waves of energy through radical movements around the world. The IWW supported the Bolsheviks. So did Seattle AFL longshoremen, who refused to load machine guns headed for the U.S. anti-Bolshevik expeditionary force in Siberia. It was in this period that the Socialist Party split and the Communist Party formed. The example of the Bolshevik Revolution was powerful, and the capitalist sphere of revolution was equally strong. The U.S. government launched a major campaign to crush U.S. left forces. The Wobblies came under intensive state attack. Organizers in Chicago were rounded up in 1918, thrown into Cook County Jail to await a conspiracy trial, which then went on for months. Frank Little, a Native American and a prominent Wobbly organizer, was lynched in Butte, Montana in 1917 for his opposition to World War I. He and Joe Hill, legally lynched by the state of Utah in 1915, were martyrs in the Wobbly cause. The Palmer raids hit in 1920. J. Edgar Hoover headed the Radical Squad in the Justice Department and made his reputation through these raids. 10,000 people were rounded up and thrown in jail. Some were tortured. Many, like Emma Goldman, were deported. The government whipped up anti-red and anti-immigrant hysteria, a climate which led up to the frame and murder of Sacco and Vanzetti a few years later. The Wobblies were finally crushed. Beset by internal division and lack of effective organization, they were unable to deal with the smashing force of state repression. Some of their great leaders, like Big Bill Haywood, were forced into exile. Gompers and the AFL leadership joined in the anti-Bolshevik campaign. They became the mouthpiece for the rulers, the labor wedge in the onslaught against U.S. leftists. Americanism was once again the watchword. The enemy was the immigrant, the black, the Mexican, and the militant woman striker, all forces of opposition. This is similar to AFL-CIO President George Meany's patriotic attacks on the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War. Attacks on the left were aimed at diffusing the revolutionary movement in the wake of the Russian Revolution, and also at ensuring U.S. gains made during World War I could be consolidated. With its European rivals badly battered from the war, the U.S. tightened its hold on Latin America and made aggressive moves towards China. The U.S. entered a new era as a major world power. While opposition continued, Debs drew 1 million votes in the presidential campaign of 1920. Masses of people were mobilized behind the goal of expanding the empire as a sure way to prosperity. William Greene, who succeeded Gompers as president of the AFL, argued that strikes were no longer needed, that imperialism would bring the U.S. working class great economic benefits. This kind of opportunism and national chauvinism within the U.S. labor movement helped isolate the radical forces. Parallel to these developments was a marked increase in terror directed at the black population. This was reflected in a wave of lynchings, organized attacks on black communities, and the rapid growth of the Klan in the post-World War I period. Between 1910 and 1920, over 300,000 black people had moved north and begun life in the cities. For years, northern industries had refused to hire black laborers, instead relying on the seemingly endless supply of cheap immigrant labor. But with European immigration disrupted by the war, and following on the heels of a severe depression in the cotton industry, northern labor agents came south to recruit black workers. Thousands of black workers entered heavy industry. They worked in auto, steel, ironworks, and the railroads, at the toughest jobs, with the least pay and no job security. This process began the trend, which is still occurring today, of black and third world workers entering basic industry. This has now markedly changed the racial composition of the working class in these areas and has brought back the black liberation struggle to the industrial center of the U.S. Black men also joined the segregated armed forces. Over a third of all U.S. troops in Europe were black. Returning home after the war, they were often the target of racial attacks, and they fought back. This trend has continued after every U.S. war, and as more and more black men came home and angry and armed. The cities were tense places, as white mobs assaulted the just settling in black people. Black communities defended themselves with arms in Chicago and Washington, D.C. In the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, the white mayor ordered an aerial bombardment of the black section of town. The tenacity of black defenders temporarily turned back the white civilian attacks. It was under these conditions of black people developing new urban communities and defending them, combined with a race pride and identification with African anti-colonial struggles, that the Garvey movement grew strong and the Harlem Renaissance of black music and art flowed. Marcus Garvey claimed 1 million members for his Universal Negro Improvement Association. This movement expressed an upsurge of black consciousness of oppression as a colonized people. It also expressed a well-grounded lack of faith in the reliability of white allies. Garvey set up a steamship company and developed plans for an exodus to Africa. The collapse of some of these projects, combined with state repression of the UNIA, contributed to the organization's decline. But its spirit lived on, as evidenced in black nationalist movements of today. The Great Depression and the Communist Party. The myth that the U.S. economy was somehow headed for continued prosperity outside the normal laws and cycles of capitalist development was rudely shattered by the Great Depression, which started in 1929. From the U.S., it rapidly spread to the rest of the capitalist world. Only the socialist USSR remained untouched. Production in the U.S. fell to 60% of the previous year.
At least 17 million people were out of jobs at the worst point, over one-third of the labor force. Piles of food, coffee, grain, beans were burned, dumped in the ocean, or contaminated with fuel oil to get them off the glutted market and raise food prices, while millions went hungry. Small businesses were ruined, teachers and professors were out on the street, farmers were forced off their farms. On the bread lines, at the Red Cross offices, at relief centers, city halls, state capitals, federal offices, the unemployed and the dispossessed began to fight back. Veterans marching to Washington, D.C. got beat, gassed, and thrown out of the city by troops commanded by General Douglas MacArthur, on orders from President Herbert Hoover. The Communist Party, along with the unemployed councils, led demonstrations and actions. When evicted tenants had their furniture dumped on the street by order of their landlords, members of the unemployed councils would organize and haul the furniture back into the house, often past armed sheriffs and deputies. The Communist Party began to grow and train the organizers who later helped the CIO. A major campaign for unemployment insurance was launched, which in a few years led to the creation of the Social Security system. As industries began to recover, some workers were rehired, the unemployed and the students began to get jobs back. Communists and other militant organizers began a drive to transform the existing company unions in the basic industries into real weapons of class struggle. Auto, steel, meatpacking, maritime trades, lumber, food processing were major targets. This became the period of sit-down strikes and other direct action innovations. In Toledo, Ohio, workers and the unemployed together violated a ban on mass picketing during the 1934 strike at Autolite. The 1934 West Coast Maritime Workers' Strike united several craft unions in defiance of conservative AFL leaders. The police murder of two San Francisco strikers during the first days of the strike touched off bloody battles in the city and resulted in the San Francisco General Strike. Black people were hit hardest by the Depression. Between the start of the Depression and the onset of World War II, blacks lost one-third of their jobs in industry and most of their positions in the skilled trades. In 1940, unemployment rates for northern black people were 133% higher than whites. In 1935, black people in Harlem boycotted stores which refused to hire black workers. Their slogan was, "Don't buy if you can't work." This campaign led a rebellion in Harlem in the summer of 1935 after a black youth was shot by store detectives in one of the affected stores. In the South, black sharecroppers engaged in major struggles, some of them jointly with poor white farmers. The Alabama Sharecroppers Union helped organize the first series of protests against the Scott Burroughs case, the frame-up of 9 Southern black men accused of raping 2 white women. Meetings of the Sharecroppers Union had to be kept secret for fear of police terror. Ralph Gray, a black leader of the group, was lynched by a white mob during one of the sharecropper struggles. The sharecropper movement was one of the most significant upsurges in black action and protest in the South since Reconstruction days. This was the era of unorganized and unskilled labor, those workers long excluded from the labor movement. Many of the strikers were women, many were black. Few were organized into AFL unions. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, led by John L. Lewis, was formed in 1935 for the purpose of organizing the unorganized. In the major industries, communists were at the core of CIO drives. They were great union organizers, and Lewis was realistic enough to rely on them to crack the toughest anti-union strongholds. In the next few years, CIO campaigns won basic rights for millions of workers. The CIO opened up its membership to black people, breaking the whites-only practice of AFL craft unions. 200,000 black workers joined the CIO in the years preceding World War II. This was a time of great unity and militancy, of life and death battles for the right to organize and picket, for union recognition, decent pay, decent working conditions, and human dignity. The AFL hierarchy was pushed aside as the masses of U.S. workers took center stage. In 1936, workers at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan staged a 44-day sit-down strike. This forced GM to grant union recognition and also galvanized the working class throughout the nation. A major victory was also won in 1937 in the fight to organize the steel industry. By the end of the Second World War, the CIO no longer played this revolutionary role. Many CIO unions had enforced no-strike pledges against their membership during the war. Many CIO leaders, like Sidney Hillman of the Alligator Clothing Workers, were functioning almost within the Roosevelt administration. The CIO also had a Southern organizing committee, but never organized in the South. It backed off the task of confronting white supremacy in the Southern industry and accepted the formation of Jim Crow unions.
reflecting their own acceptance of the privileges and ethic of U.S. empire, especially during the period of the World War II economic boom, and pushed by state pressure and conservative leadership, many labor unions lined up behind anti-communism. At the 1946 CIO convention, Philip Murray, the president of the CIO, put the finishing touches on this corruption by reading communists out of the later labor movement. Communist and left-led unions were expelled from the CIO, and finally the CIO merged with the AFL. The AFL-CIO became an ardent defender of the Cold War, and its national leadership now functions for all intents and purposes as an arm of U.S. imperialism. They no longer represent the unorganized, the poor, and the dispossessed. Roosevelt granted some concessions to the labor movement in order to save the system as a whole. The Wagner Act of 1935 recognized the rights of most workers to unionize. This was a victory, although the act left out the militant Chicano farm workers in the West, as well as most industries employing large numbers of women. Roosevelt's aim was to use the power of the labor movement as a wedge in convincing a sector of the ruling class that state regulation of the capitalist system was needed to ensure stability. Roosevelt also tried to ally himself with the labor leadership and bring it under the wing of the U.S. government. These were the strategic goals of the New Deal. From the Depression years until the Second World War, the CPUSA was the main force of the organized left in the United States. The Communist Party was in the front lines of countless struggles of the unemployed, the homeless, Southern black sharecroppers, women textile workers, groups hit hardest and most ready to fight. Around the Communist Party flourished a cultural upheaval. Writers, painters, poets were mobilized into the struggle and produced a unique people's art. The Communist Party stressed the special importance of the black liberation movement. Black people were recognized as an oppressed nation in the South, then called a Negro nation, with the right of self-determination, which white revolutionaries were bound to support. This was a great breakthrough. Communists engaged in persistent battles against white chauvinism and white supremacy both within and outside the party. Communist Party organizers challenged racism in the labor movement. The Communist Party did active work in the Scottsboro case, making it a central part of party work in the shops as well as in the defense committees. Many black people joined the party in this period. The Harlem branch was one of the biggest and most active. Black organizers were among the most effective Communist Party spokespeople. Strikes break through police lines. Minneapolis Teamster Strike, 1934, in Image. Communists circulated work of black scholars and did important historical research themselves, which uncovered black and revolutionary history. This was like a flash of light. They failed, however, to analyze the culture of U.S. empire building within the oppressor nation or to deal with it in practice. This became a cause of the Communist Party's eventual political bankruptcy. In a great demonstration of international solidarity, communists joined the fight against fascism in Spain in 1935. Nearly 2,000 people in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade there, and many gave their lives. The center of the world struggle at this time was the battle to defeat fascism. But the U.S. government, along with those of Britain and France, wanted Hitler to attack the Soviet Union and hopefully destroy it before they would enter the war against Germany. The Western imperialist powers had long isolated the Soviet Union, setting her up for Nazi attack. In 1936, communist parties around the world adopted the strategy of a united front against fascism. Communists everywhere were urged to unite with all progressive forces in their respective countries to defeat fascism and protect the Soviet Union. In some countries like China, the United Front strategy was applied effectively, with the Chinese communists maintaining their own separate identity, program, and army. In the United States, the Communist Party submerged its identity with the CIO. It fought for economic gains, but did not keep alive a vision of socialism and revolution. It stopped fighting its own imperialism. This is opportunism. While concealment from union officials and company spies was sometimes necessary in order to work and organize, party members retreated from doing open communist organizing in their day-to-day work. This made it easier for the CIO to denounce hidden communists in the witch hunts after the war. In 1941, when A. Philip Randolph organized a march on Washington for more black jobs, the Communist Party refused support in the name of the war mobilization effort. This was correctly viewed as a desertion by black people. During the Second World War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were allied in the fight against German and Japanese imperialism. This presented a complex situation for CPUSA. Its response was to abandon almost all of its opposition to U.S. imperialism. It failed, for instance, to condemn the imprisonment of Japanese families in concentration camps on the West Coast. It abandoned its position on the central nature of the black liberation struggle, with Earl Browder, the wartime leader of the party, declaring that black people had chosen the path of integration. This was part of the Communist Party's betrayal of its revolutionary critique of imperialism, a new version of American exceptionalism. Browder also declared that the age of American imperialism has ended, in a speech at the end of World War II. After the war, these Communist Party policies were reversed for a while. Browder was expelled from the party, but the changes did not last. When Cold War repression came, the Communist Party found that its non-struggle direction could not be reversed easily. The Communist Party had lost its capacity to fight. Tens of thousands of supporters and party members deserted the struggle. The Communist Party retreated further into reform politics. It joined in the Soviet denunciations of China, renounced revolutionary violence, and began supporting liberal Democrats. It still has not done a full criticism of these positions or of the mistakes of the 40s and 50s. This means that the Communist Party has not changed in a revolutionary way, and the lessons of struggle have not been passed on for the future. We have much to learn from the experience and wisdom accumulated over the years by Communist Party workers of that period. The Communist Party in its early history was a great advance in the U.S. Revolution. Its reversals and wrong directions are a defeat for us all. This is why the lessons must be drawn sharply. In the 50s, the Communist Party was hit head-on with a vicious campaign of anti-communism and counter-revolution. Truman was consolidating a base for imperial war, for massive atomic arms race, for the invasion of Korea by hunting and terrorizing U.S. communists. It was then that Richard Nixon began his political criminal career with the Alger Hiss case. Smith Act's trial jailed the party leadership for not cooperating with the McCarthy investigations. Many communists and progressives were expelled from trade unions, lost teaching jobs, went underground, and were tormented by the FBI. A bitter example of the U.S. attack on internal opposition to the Cold War was the frame-up and execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg in the Atom spy case. Their murder at the hands of the Eisenhower-Nixon government was committed after a trial in which their socialist beliefs, anti-fascist stands, and refusal to falsely inform on friends were used as proof as conspiracy to steal the non-existent A-bomb secret. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world stood vigil on the night of the execution. The assassination of the Rosenbergs was meant to silence all opposition to U.S. imperialism. The truth about the Rosenbergs is just today being understood, another step on the long march toward exposing the crimes of this empire and uncovering the truth of our own past. Bottom of page 76, a photo of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Page 77. When you deal with the past, you're dealing with history. You're dealing actually with the origin of a thing. When you know the origin, you know the cause. If you don't know the origin, you don't know the cause. And if you don't know the cause, you don't know the reason, you're just cut off. You're left standing in midair. So the past deals with history or the origin of anything, the origin of a person, the origin of a nation, the origin of an incident. And when you know the origin, then you have a better understanding of the causes that produce whatever originated there and its reason for originating and its reason for being. It's impossible for you and me to have a balanced mind in this society without going into the past. Because in this particular society, as we function and fit into right now, we're such an underdog, we're trampled on, we're looked on as almost nothing. Malcolm X. Page 78. We will simply say that imperialism can be defined as the worldwide expression of the search for profits and the ever-increasing accumulation of surplus value by monopoly financial capital centered in Europe and then in North America. And if we wish to place the fact of imperialism within the general trajectory of the evolution of transcendental far-ranging factor, which has changed the face of the world, capital, and the process of its accumulation, we can say that imperialism is piracy, transplanted from the seas to dry land. Piracy reorganized, consolidated, and adapted to the aims of exploiting the natural and human resources of our people. But if we can calmly analyze the imperialist phenomenon, we will not shock anybody by admitting that imperialism, which everything points to is the last stage of capitalism, was a historical necessity, a consequence of the development of the productive forces and of the transformation of the methods of production in the general contour of humanity as a whole in movement. A necessity, just as the national liberation of the peoples, the destruction of capitalism, and the arrival of socialism are at present. Amilcar Cabral.